Headlights cut through the thick smog of the alleyway, reflecting off the rusted, graffiti-covered cars that lined the curb outside the Caldwell house at midnight on a Tuesday. Mara, dressed in worn denim overalls over a stained white t-shirt, was about to lock the deadbolt and try to sleep when a car worth more than her entire neighborhood rolled slowly to a stop. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her hand gripped the cold wooden stock of her father's old rifle. No one drove $1 million car down these dead-end streets, not unless they were Eli Cross's collectors. 3 years ago, her father had died, leaving Mara nothing but a rotting porch and a debt that felt like a noose. That debt now belonged to Eli Cross, a street predator known for making people disappear for far less than she owed. Mara had lived in the shadow of fear for a long time, but tonight the air felt different, heavy with a power she didn't recognize. A car door opened. A man in a tailored black suit stepped out, his presence instantly clashing with the gritty, neon-lit backdrop of the slums. He wasn't one of Cross's thugs. This man moved with the unyielding authority of a king, a man whose name made even predators like Eli Cross hide in the shadows. Even in the dim porch light, Mara could see the intricate tattoo winding up his neck and the sharp, unblinking intensity in his gaze. He walked toward her porch with steady, predatory grace. "Are you Mara Caldwell?" His voice was a low, smooth rasp, more accustomed to giving life-altering commands than asking questions. Mara raised the rifle to her chest, her eyes narrowed as she aimed straight at the intruder. "Who are you? You're on private property." He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the barrel. "The safety is still on, and I can tell by the way you're holding it that there isn't a round in the chamber." Mara's face went pale, but her grip didn't waver. "I'm not looking for trouble." He stopped at the bottom of her rotting wooden steps. In his eyes, Mara saw a flicker of something she never expected from a man like him. Desperation, cold, calculated, and raw. "I'm here to offer you a way out," he stated. Near midnight, in an alley where people killed for $20, a mafia boss stood on her porch bleeding authority. Mara tightened her finger near the trigger. "What kind of way out?" "Marry me," Dante Moretti said, "by tomorrow morning." Mara blinked, her mind reeling. "You've lost your mind. Why me?" "I need a wife with a clean name, and I have exactly 9 hours to find one." He held up a phone, showing a legal morality clause. "My grandfather's will. I marry within the month, or my half-brother Luca takes the estate. And if Luca takes the estate, he takes this neighborhood too." Mara froze. The rifle trembled in her hands. "You know about Cross?" "You know Cross works for Luca," Dante replied, his eyes fixed on hers. "I know about the $150,000. I know the threats. If I lose tomorrow, Luca gives Cross the green light to collect from you, however he wants." Mara swallowed hard, the weight of the debt pressing down on her. "Who are you?" "Dante Moretti." The name made her breath hitch. Moretti, the family that owned the city's bones, the men even the sirens didn't follow. "You're Mafia?" Mara whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "Why should I trust a shark to protect me from a piranha?" "Because I need you as much as you need me," Dante said. He stood there in the dead of night, a king who came to the gutter to find his last hope. Mara stared at him, caught between the predator she knew and the boss she didn't. There was a spark in him, a sense that he was the only thing standing between her and total ruin. "If I agree," she said, her voice growing steady, "I have one condition." Dante's expression sharpened. "Name it." Mara said, "You belong to me for 30 days, lowering the rifle just enough. No bodyguards, no black cars, no weapons. You survive 1 month in my neighborhood, living in my house, seeing the world Luca wants to destroy. If you can handle my life, you can have my name." Dante Moretti didn't flinch at the demand, though the silence that followed stretched thin enough to snap. He looked at the peeling gray paint of the porch, then back at Mara, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering orange glow of a nearby street lamp. To a man who moved millions with a phone call, 30 days in the slums sounded like a triviality. But the neighborhood of Oakhaven didn't care about his pedigree. It was a concrete trap designed to chew up anyone who didn't understand its rhythm. "You want me to surrender my protection," Dante stated, his voice dropping into a dangerous low register. He leaned slightly forward, the intricate tattoo on his neck shifting as he moved. "You realize that the moment I step out of that SUV and send my men away, I become a target. My brother Luca won't just wait for the clock to run out. He will come for the throne with everything he has." Mara didn't lower the rifle. "And the moment I sign that paper, I become a target for everyone who hates the name Moretti," she countered, her eyes hard and unyielding. "If I'm going to be your clean wife to satisfy some dead man's morality clause, I need to know you won't fold the first time a window gets smashed or Eli Cross comes knocking without a formal invitation." Dante's storm gray eyes searched hers, looking for a bluff he wouldn't find. He was used to women who wanted his world, the silk sheets, the armored glass, the safety of his shadow. Mara Caldwell was asking him to step into her nightmare instead. "Luca thinks I've forgotten where our family started," Dante murmured, almost to himself. He pulled a sleek silver pin from his breast pocket and held it out toward her. "He thinks I'm soft because I wear a suit. He's about to find out he's wrong." He stepped up another stair, invading her space until the barrel of the rifle was inches from his heart. He didn't push the weapon away, he simply waited. Mara felt the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to the damp midnight air of the alley. Slowly she reached out and took the pin. "1 month, Dante," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough for him to hear. "No guards, no black market favors. You eat what I cook, you sleep where I tell you, and you fix the things that are broken. If you survive, you get your empire." "And if I don't?" Dante asked. "Then I guess Luca was right about you," Mara replied. With a steady hand, she signed her name at the bottom of the legal document, the ink appearing black under the porch light. The moment the loop of the L was finished, the deal was struck, a midnight ransom paid in blood and signatures. Dante took the paper back, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure tension that made Mara's breath hitch. Dante turned toward the glossy black SUVs idling at the curb. He raised a hand, and the heavy doors opened instantly. Dante gave a short, sharp command in Italian. His men looked at one another, confusion rippling through their disciplined ranks, but nobody dared to question him. They began to unload 2 modest leather bags onto the sidewalk. The engines roared to life, and within seconds, the taillights disappeared around the corner of the graffiti-covered building, leaving the alley in a suffocating silence. Dante Moretti stood on the cracked sidewalk, his expensive shoes resting in the dirt, looking every bit the king who had just abdicated his throne for a chance at a different kind of war. "The safety is still on, Mara," he said, turning back to the porch with a ghost of a smirk that didn't reach his tired eyes. "Are you going to let your husband inside, or do I start my 30 days on the stairs?" Mara stepped back, finally lowering the rifle, though her heart was still kicking in a wild rhythm. She pushed the heavy wooden door open, the hinges screaming in protest. "The sofa is in the living room," she said, her voice dry. "And Dante, don't get comfortable. Eli Cross usually does his rounds at 3 a.m. Dante picked up his bags and followed her into the dim warmth of the house, the door clicking shut behind them. The contract was signed, the guards were gone, and the 30-day clock had finally begun to tick. The heavy wooden door of the Caldwell house groaned as Mara pushed it open, the sound echoing through the narrow, unlit hallway. Dante followed her inside, his physical presence making the small, airless space feel even more confined than usual. He carried his own bags, a silent acknowledgement that the luxury of his former life had been left at the curb when his security detail vanished into the night. The apartment was a labyrinth of peeling wallpaper and shadows, illuminated only by the rhythmic flickering neon of a liquor store sign across the street. Mara gestured toward the living room, where a sofa with worn, duct-taped upholstery sat against a wall covered in faded family photographs. It was a far cry from the silk sheets and armored glass of the Moretti estate, a humble territory where a mafia boss was now just a man in an expensive suit that looked increasingly like a costume. "You can put your things there," Mara said, her voice dry as she pointed to a corner by the radiator. "I'll get you some blankets, but don't expect much. The heat usually cuts out by midnight." Dante didn't complain. He set his bags down and stood in the center of the room, his sharp, groomed features cast in a harsh orange glow from the street lamp outside. For the first time, Mara saw the exhaustion behind his storm-cold eyes, a weariness that suggested he had forgotten how to exist in a world where he wasn't always a target. As the hour grew later, the neighborhood began to breathe. It wasn't the quiet, manicured silence of the suburbs, but a jagged symphony of sirens, distant shouting, and the constant hum of the city's decay. Dante sat on the edge of the sofa, his posture rigid, his ears tuned to every floorboard that creaked and every engine that roared past the window. Without his bodyguards or his palace to hide in, he was vulnerable, a king stripped of his armor in a place where people killed for far less than his name. Around 3 a.m., the sharp, unmistakable crack of gunfire erupted 3 blocks away. Mara, used to the violent rhythm of Oak Haven, didn't even sit up in her bed, but she heard the sudden, heavy movement in the living room. She walked to the doorway and saw Dante standing by the window, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "It's just Oak Haven," Mara whispered, her eyes meeting his in the dark. "The bullets don't usually reach this far up the hill." Dante didn't turn around. He remained a dark silhouette against the window, watching the distant blue and red lights of a patrol car reflect off the graffiti-covered cars in the alley. "I spent my whole life building a fortress so I would never have to hear that sound again," Dante said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Then welcome to the real world, Dante," Mara replied softly. "In this neighborhood, we don't have fortresses. We just have each other." She turned back toward her room, leaving him alone with the sirens. The first night of his 30-day sentence had begun, and as the cold began to seep through the window frames, the Mafia King was finally learning what it meant to be a commoner in a kingdom ruled by fear. The morning sun didn't rise over Oak Haven so much as it bruised the sky a sickly shade of gray. Mara was in the kitchen, nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee and listening to the rattle of the radiator when the heavy, rhythmic thudding started on the front door. It wasn't a neighborly knock. It was the sound of someone who owned the wood they were hitting. Mara's hand trembled, the ceramic clinking against her teeth. She knew that rhythm. It was the herald of a debt that never stayed settled. Dante was off the sofa before the third strike, his movements fluid and silent despite the lack of sleep etched into the lines around his eyes. He didn't have his tailored jacket on, just the crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that looked like they were forged from corded steel. He caught Mara's gaze, a silent question in his storm gray eyes, but she was already moving toward the door. "It's Vince," she whispered, her voice tight. "Knuckles, he works for Cross." She opened the door just enough to see the hulking frame of Vince Romano. He was a man built like a meat locker, wearing a cheap leather jacket that strained against his shoulders. He didn't wait for an invitation. He shoved the door back, forcing Mara to stumble toward the hallway wall. Cross is getting impatient, Mara, Vince growled, his voice like gravel in a blender. He stepped into the foyer, his eyes scanning the peeling wallpaper with practiced greed. He heard a rumor you got yourself a man. He wants to know if that man has his money or if he needs to start taking interest out of your hide. Vince stopped mid-stride as his eyes landed on Dante. For a second, the air in the small hallway felt thick enough to choke on. Vince looked at Dante's expensive trousers, his groomed features, and the intricate tattoo climbing his neck. He didn't recognize the face of the Moretti King, but he recognized a threat when he saw one. "Who the hell is this? One of your marks?" Vince sneered, stepping toward Dante. He raised a hand, intent on grabbing Dante's collar, but he never completed the motion. Dante didn't reach for a gun or call for the shadows to protect him. He moved with a terrifying, calibrated speed. In one motion, he stepped inside Vince's reach, caught the collector's wrist, and applied a pressure that made the larger man's knees buckle. Dante didn't punch, he didn't scream. He simply used Vince's own momentum to pin him against the doorframe, his forearm pressed firmly against the man's throat. "You're making a lot of noise for someone who doesn't realize he's standing in a private residence," Dante said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that made Mara's breath hitch. It wasn't the roar of a street fighter, it was the cold command of a man who decided who lived and died. Vince struggled, his face turning a mottled purple, his knuckles white as he tried to claw at Dante's arm. "You don't know who you're messing with," he gasped. Cross will do nothing," Dante interrupted, his eyes boring into Vince's with a predatory focus. "Because you're going to go back and tell him that Mara Caldwell is under new management. And if I see your face on this porch again, I won't be this gentle." Mara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected a bloodbath, the kind of senseless violence she'd seen Dante's world associated with. But Dante showed a restraint that was even more frightening. He held Vince at the edge of consciousness, his expression unyielding and stern. He was an imposing man with an air of authority, yet he didn't break a single bone. He used his wits and his physical presence to dismantle Vince's ego without ever losing his own cool intensity. With a sudden release, Dante shoved Vince back out onto the porch. The collector stumbled, gasping for air, his bravado shattered. He didn't look back. He scrambled down the rotting stairs and vanished into the gray alleyway. Dante stood in the doorway for a long moment, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just been reminded of the filth he was trying to clean up. He turned back to Mara, his sleeve still rolled up, the neck tattoo stark against his pale skin. "You didn't break his hand," Mara said, her voice small in the sudden quiet of the house. "You promised I would survive your neighborhood, Mara," Dante replied, his eyes softening just a fraction as he looked at her. "I didn't say I would burn it down. Not yet." Mara looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see a mafia boss or a business transaction. She saw a protector who knew the value of a hand that didn't always have to be a fist. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Vince Knuckles Romano had long since faded, leaving behind a heavy, vibrating silence in the small kitchen. Dante sat on a wooden chair that creaked under his weight, his large frame hunched as he rested his hands on the scarred oak table. His knuckles were split and purpling, the only evidence of the restraint he had used to drive the collector from the porch. Mara approached him tentatively, carrying a plastic bowl of warm water and a clean, threadbare cloth. "Sit still," she murmured, her voice losing its defensive edge as she sat beside him. Dante didn't move. He watched her with an unyielding, stern intensity as she dipped the cloth into the water. When she took his hand, his fingers instinctively twitched, but he didn't pull away. Her touch was light, her small, calloused hands a stark contrast to his own, which looked as though they were forged for violence. As she carefully dabbed away the blood, her eyes drifted from his hands to the intricate dark ink winding up the left side of his neck. Up close, the tattoo was a chaotic masterpiece of thorns and shadow. "Does it mean something?" Mara asked, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "Or is it just to make you look like a man people should fear?" Dante was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He looked out the window at the graffiti-covered alley, his expression distant and cold. "My mother gave it to me," he said finally, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Not the ink, but the reason for it. She was the only person who saw me as anything other than a Moretti heir. When she died, my father tried to erase her memory, her name, her photos, everything. I got this to make sure that every time he looked at me, he saw the one thing he couldn't control. It's a reminder that I don't just belong to the family. I belong to the ghost of the woman who actually loved me." Mara paused, the wet cloth hovering over his skin. She saw the flash of raw, unhidden pain in his storm-gray eyes, the same desperation she had glimpsed on her porch the night he arrived. It was the mark of a man who had been forced to turn his grief into armor. "I keep this place for the same reason," Mara said softly, looking around the peeling walls of the kitchen. "Everyone tells me to sell, to take whatever Eli Cross offers and run. But my father, he built these cabinets. He fixed this radiator 1,000 times. He worked double shifts at the docks for 20 years just to make sure I had a roof that didn't leak." She looked back at Dante, her brown eyes bright with a fierce, protective pride. He died with nothing in his bank account, but he died knowing he kept his word. "I'm not just paying off a debt, Dante. I'm honoring the only man who never lied to me. I can't let Cross turn his life's work into a drug den." Dante studied her, his gaze softening in a way that made Mara's heart stumble. He saw the hyper-independence that made her see every hand reached out as a trap, but he also saw the iron-willed loyalty that mirrored his own. "He sounded like a king," Dante murmured, his voice losing its predatory edge. "He was," Mara replied, a small, sad smile flickering across her lips as she finished bandaging his hand. Dante looked down at the neat white gauze, then up at Mara. In the dim light of the kitchen, surrounded by the shadows of their shared history, the Mafia King and the waitress weren't just parts of a business transaction anymore. They were two broken souls finding the first traces of a sanctuary they hadn't known they were searching for. The transition from a man who destroyed to a man who built began not with a grand gesture, but with the rhythmic metallic rasp of a file against a rusted strike plate. Dante Moretti had traded his silk blazer for a plain gray t-shirt that stretched tight across his shoulders, and by the third morning, the Mafia King was kneeling in the dirt of the front porch, fixing the deadbolt that had been sticking for years. Mara watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed, waiting for him to grow frustrated and quit. Instead, he worked with a cold, focused intensity, his large, tattooed hands surprisingly precise as he adjusted the tumblers. He didn't stop at the porch. Within a week, the flickering orange street lamp that had served as a beacon for drug deals was replaced with a steady, bright LED that Dante had somehow procured and installed himself. He spent his afternoons in the dim alleyway, clearing the glass shards and debris that had accumulated since her father's death. The neighbors, who had initially peered through cracked blinds with suspicion, began to linger on their steps. They saw the imposing man with the neck tattoo not as a threat, but as a silent force of order in a neighborhood ruled by chaos. "The lock on the 4B apartment is broken too," a young boy whispered one afternoon, standing a safe distance away as Dante painted over a particularly aggressive piece of graffiti on the side of the house. Dante didn't look up, but he nodded, and the next morning, the 4B door closed with a solid, secure thud for the first time in a decade. Slowly, the spirit of the street began to shift. It was a subtle transformation, born of the realization that someone was finally watching over them. Old Mrs. Gable from across the way brought over a plate of cookies, her hands trembling as she handed them to the man she called the tall gentleman. Dante accepted them with a stern, unyielding expression, but Mara saw the way his eyes softened when the woman thanked him for making the sidewalk safe enough to walk on after dark. Dante was becoming a local hero, a title that sat awkwardly on a man who had spent his life in the shadows. He used his wits and his physical presence to command respect without ever raising his voice or a fist. He was fixing the spirit of the people by proving that they weren't forgotten, a concept that Mara found herself beginning to believe in too. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving Oakhaven, she was living in it. "You're changing this place," Mara said one evening as they sat on the newly painting porch steps, the air finally clear of the heavy scent of decay. "I'm just fixin' what's broken, Mara," Dante replied, his voice a low, rough rasp. He looked at his hands, now stained with grease and paint instead of blood. Sometimes that's all a man can do to prove he's still human. The transition from the cracked sidewalks of Oakhaven to the cold marble expanse of the Moretti estate felt like crossing into a different dimension. Dante stood tall in his tailored suit, the neck tattoo once again a sharp contrast against a crisp white collar, but his hands, still healing from the work on the porch and the radiator, remained calloused. Beside him, Mara felt the weight of the high-end dress Dante had provided, yet she carried herself with the same fierce, protective pride she had used to defend her father's kitchen. They were stepping into a den of wolves, and the air in the grand council chamber was thick with a judgment that smelled of expensive tobacco and ancient, rot-filled secrets. The elders sat behind a massive black oak table, their faces unreadable masks of stone, while Luca Moretti stood at the center of the room with a triumphant smirk. As soon as Dante and Mara took their places, Luca stepped forward, tossing a thick folder onto the table with the practiced flair of a man who believed he had already won. He presented his proof with a voice dripping in contempt, detailing the midnight agreement, the shared debt, and the lack of a traditional courtship. He called the marriage a business transaction, a con designed to steal an inheritance through a farm girl who didn't know the difference between a vintage wine and a cheap beer. "Look at them," Luca sneered, his eyes drilling into Mara with open disdain. "My brother didn't find a wife. He bought a shield. This isn't a union of hearts. It's a fraud built on desperation and ink." A heavy silence settled over the chamber as the elders exchanged doubtful glances, their murmurs rolling through the room like a gathering storm. Dante started to rise, his jaw tight and his gray eyes turning to ice, but Mara reached out and touched his arm, a silent command for him to wait. She stood before the council, her heart pounding like a war drum, but her voice remained clear and steady as she looked at each member of the family. "You want to talk about proof?" Mara asked, her gaze landing on Luca before moving back to the elders. "Then look at his hands. For 30 days, a man you call a king lived in a neighborhood where the police won't even go. He didn't use bodyguards to clear the street. He used a file and a hammer to fix the locks on doors that hadn't been secured in a decade." She stepped closer to the table, her brown eyes bright with an iron-willed loyalty. "He traded his palace for a cramped apartment because I asked him to. He learned to protect people who have nothing, proving that his power doesn't come from a gun or a name, but from the character he showed when no one was watching." Mara turned to Dante, her expression softening in a way that silenced the room. "A contract might have brought him to my porch, but the man who stayed, the man who bled for my safety and worked for my neighbors is the man I chose to stand beside. If you think that kind of loyalty can be faked, then you don't know the value of the man leading this family." The silence that followed was absolute. Luca's smirk vanished as he realized the elders were no longer looking at his files, but at the calloused hands of the man who had humbled himself for a month in the grit. Mr. Castellano, the senior member of the council, studied Mara for a long moment before nodding slowly. When the vote was called, the result was a crushing blow to Luca's ambitions. The council recognized the marriage as valid, swayed by the testimony of a woman who had seen the king become a commoner and come out stronger for it. The victory at the Moretti estate proved to be a fragile shield, as the darkness of Oakhaven didn't wait for the ink to dry on the council's decree. On the 29th night, just as the 30-day challenge reached its final, agonizing hours, the neighborhood felt unnervingly silent, the usual symphony of distant sirens replaced by a heavy, predatory stillness. Mara was walking back from a late shift at the diner, her mind already picturing the newly fixed porch where Dante would be waiting, when a van with no plates cut across the sidewalk, blocking the mouth of the alley. Before she could scream or reach for the pocket knife she now carried, two men in heavy tactical gear, Luca's professional shadows, dragged her into the darkness, followed closely by the shark-like grin of Eli Cross. Dante knew something was wrong the moment the clock struck midnight and the front door didn't groan on its hinges. He didn't have his encrypted comms or his small army of soldiers, but as he stepped out onto the porch, he realized he had something Luca never would, the loyalty of a street he had rebuilt with his own hands. He didn't need a GPS to track her, he just needed to look at the shadows. A young boy, the same one from the 4B apartment whose door Dante had fixed, stepped out from behind a rusted dumpster, pointing a trembling finger toward the abandoned meatpacking plant at the edge of the district. "They took her there, Mr. Dante," the boy whispered, his eyes wide with a protective fear. Dante moved through the alleyways not as a mob boss, but as a ghost who knew every cracked brick and broken light in Oakhaven. He moved with a cold, predatory focus, gathering intelligence from the neighbors who watched from behind their reinforced deadbolts, the very locks he had installed. They whispered directions from their windows, a decentralized network of eyes that Eli Cross and Luca Moretti had completely discounted. By the time Dante reached the warehouse, he knew exactly how many men were inside, because the tall gentleman was no longer a stranger to these streets. He was their king. Inside the freezing warehouse, Mara was bound to a rusted chair, her cheek bruised where Luca had struck her to silence her defiance. Eli Cross paced the perimeter, a jagged blade in his hand, checking his watch with a greedy hunger. 10 minutes left on your little challenge, sweetheart," Cross sneered, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel. "Luca wants you dead before the sun rises, so he can tell the council your hero couldn't even protect his own wife." Mara didn't flinch. She met Luca's cold gaze with an iron-willed pride, her voice steady even in the face of death. "You think you're in control, Luca, but you're standing in a neighborhood that belongs to us now." The heavy steel doors didn't explode with the sound of a professional breach. They were pried open from the outside by the very tools Dante had used to fix the neighborhood's spirit. Dante stepped into the light, his gray t-shirt stained with the grit of the alley and his neck tattoo stark against his pale skin. He stood alone, without a gun or a blazer, his presence casting a shadow that made even Eli Cross hesitate. "The 30 days aren't up yet, Luca." Dante's voice was a low, terrifying rasp that carried the weight of the entire neighborhood behind it. As Luca signaled his men to move in, the windows of the warehouse shattered, and the people of Oakhaven, armed with the same tools and grit Dante had taught them to value, began to pour in, proving that a leader who builds is far more dangerous than one who only knows how to destroy. The warehouse air, thick with the scent of rusted iron and stagnant water, felt like it was charged with a high-voltage current. Dante didn't wait for the shock of the neighborhood's entry to fade. He moved with the brutal efficiency of a man who had spent 30 days learning that some things were worth more than an empire. He reached Mara in a blur of motion, his calloused hands, the same hands that had spent weeks fixing locks and scrubbing graffiti, tearing through her restraints with a desperate, focused intensity. As the people of Oakhaven held Luca's hired shadows at bay with the sheer weight of their numbers and their grit, Dante stood between Mara and the wreckage of her past. Eli Cross lunged forward, the blade in his hand gleaming under the flickering yellow bulb, but Dante caught his wrist mid-air. There was no hesitation, no calculation of the cost. Dante simply used the strength he had honed in the alleyways to disarm the predator, a cold, unyielding power radiating from him that made Cross collapse in a heap of shattered bravado. Dante turned his gaze toward Luca, who stood paralyzed in the center of the warehouse, the victory he had thought was certain now as gray and hollow as the concrete beneath his feet. The gray eyes that had once been storm-cold and sharp now held a different kind of authority, one tempered by the dirt and resilience of the street. Dante walked toward his half-brother, his neck tattoo stark against his skin, embodying the powerful presence of a leader who no longer relied on fear alone. He could have ended it there, ending the bloodline rivalry with a single violent act, but Mara's hand found his, her fingers interlacing with his calloused palm in a silent plea for a different kind of resolution. "You wanted the legacy, Luca," Dante said, his voice a low, rough rasp that echoed off the corrugated steel. "But you don't even know what a legacy is. It isn't a bank account or a title. It's the trust of the people you're supposed to lead." He stepped closer, his demeanor unyielding and stern. "I won't kill you, but you are dead to this family. Total exile. You leave the city tonight, and if you ever step foot in my territory or near my wife, I won't be a builder anymore. I'll be the monster you always thought I was." Luca, stripped of his arrogance and his allies, turned and walked out of the warehouse, a ghost vanishing into the cold night air. The Mafia King didn't watch him go. He turned back to Mara, pulling her into a protective embrace that felt like the first real sanctuary either of them had ever known. In the weeks that followed, the transition of the Moretti legacy began in earnest, but it didn't start in a boardroom. It started on the porch of the Caldwell house, where Dante and Mara sat together as the sun rose over a neighborhood that was no longer ruled by fear and decay. The debt to Eli Cross was erased, replaced by a new kind of investment, one that saw the boss and his queen using their resources to rebuild the very streets that had saved them. They worked side by side, fixing the spirit of the people by proving that trust wasn't a trap, but a foundation. As the 30-day clock finally reached its end, the Harper farm girl and the Mafia Boss had built something that could survive any storm. They had turned a business transaction into an empire of two, a kingdom of grit and loyalty, where the tall gentleman with the neck tattoo was finally safe, not because of his fortress, but because of the woman who had taught him how to survive her life.